Good evening, everyone. I am Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute, and I want to welcome everybody to tonight's wonderful lecture. I preface it by saying it's a wonderful lecture without hearing it. A little bit like the French literary critic who continued to write reviews of plays that he didn't see. And when he was asked how he could write such wonderful plays, such wonderful reviews, so insightful about plays that he didn't see, he said he didn't want his opinions to interfere with his judgments. And so my judgment is this is going to be a wonderful lecture. And usually when I stand up here, I have to do a little explaining about what the YIVO Institute is. And tonight, just looking around the auditorium, I see that I'm addressing essentially Yiddish royalty. We have so many people here tonight who are so deeply learned, who are at the height of their professions, that it's truly wonderful to have all of you here tonight. And so I will dispense with the few words about the YIVO Institute, which I recognize are completely unnecessary. Only to say one thing, that today we are engaged in an extraordinary project that I want you all to know about, which is what we call the Edward Blank YIVO Vilna Collections Project, which is to preserve, to digitize, to conserve, and to make available on a web platform all of the documents of YIVO's pre-war collection that were saved from the Nazis and then were saved from the Soviets. It is a project that involves a partnership with the Lithuanian government, with the Lithuanian National Library, with the Lithuanian Central State Archives, as well as developing a team of researchers, archivists, librarians here at 15 West 16th Street to digitize our holdings, which until now, in many cases, we have not thoroughly cataloged or processed. It is a very big undertaking. It's a 7-year project at a cost of about $5.5 million. And what distinguishes it from so many other projects in the Jewish world right now devoted to digitization is that not only are we digitizing materials, but this is a project of discovery. It's a project whereby new collections of hitherto unknown materials are coming to light, both in Lithuania and here. And so it's a very exciting project. I invite all of you to pick up the brochures outside concerning it and pay attention, because there will be some very, very interesting revelations of materials that come out of this. So without any further comment, I want to introduce Eddie Portnoy, who is the academic advisor for the YIVO Institute, who will introduce Professor Miron.
Thank you, Jonathan. I will be brief. Don Maroni is the Leonard K. Professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He's the author of more than 20 books in both Hebrew and English. His books include The Prophetic Mode in Modern Hebrew Poetry, a study of the poet and playwright Natan Alterman, From the Worm a Butterfly Emerges, and 2 studies of the classics of Yiddish fiction, The Image of the Shtetl and Other Studies of Modern Jewish Literary Imagination, and A Traveler Disguised, The Rise of Modern Yiddish Fiction in the 19th Century. In 1980, he received the Bialik Prize for Jewish Thought, and in 1993, he was awarded the Israel Prize for Hebrew Literature. 20 years ago, I sat in a seminar with Professor Miron, and it was incredible. Every word a pearl. He is an Emes HaGodel Ador. Tonight he'll be speaking on Mandela as a modern Jewish cultural intellectual. It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce Don Miron.
Dear friends, it's very exciting for me to be here. I came to the YIVO in the early 60s of the former century and found there a whole community, none of them is alive now, that accepted me, an Israeli, who decided that he's going to study Yiddish literature and to write his dissertation on Yiddish literature under the guidance of the bright, the brilliant Uriel Weinreich and his father. And I'll never forget the kind of warmth and support that I received from this entire little community. I mentioned when we talked to Eddie Portner, Hannah Frischdorf, Shoshke Ehrlich, and all the other people of the YIVO at that time, and I have a very soft spot for this place. Now, let's talk about the writer we love to call Mendele. Mendele Moykher Sforim, Mendele the Book Peddler. Some would call him Zayde Mendele. It's a kind of invention that Sholem Aleichem invented. Mendele was at the time, or Abramovich was at the time, 52, 3 years old, but he became the grandfather of Yiddish literature willy-nilly. He was not so happy about it. To give the Sholem Aleichem and others the opportunity to be Einiklach. When we think about this writer, Abramovich, what comes to our mind? What are the images, the ideas, the concept that we get? And I'm not talking only about those who thoroughly read the works of Abramovich, but what was transferred, what was percolated through Yiddish culture as a whole. I think what we see, what we think about, first and foremost, is a kind of a quintessential territory, Jewish territory, a Mendele world, a place made of 3-4 shtetler and of one bigger place, commercial town, and completely Jewish. You will never think that Goyim lived in these places, but they did. They were left out of the picture. The place where they could be found was the space between the shtetler. The space was agricultural, rustic, non-Jewish, beautiful, bountiful, alien. Not necessarily spiteful or hostile, but non-Jewish. Not Jewish. The Jews were in these enclaves. Kapsansk, Tunyadovke, Glubsk. And we think about the famous characters, Fischke der Krummer, Benjamin der Dritter, and the other, Herschel from Kapsansk, who becomes Hirsch Ratman in the main novel of Abramovich, Das Windschwingel. And that's one thing. Once it was supposed to be a realistic historically true description of life in the Jewish Pale of Eastern Europe, to the degree that people thought that this was it. The famous critic David Frischman, the great critic of the beginning of the century, wrote a magisterial essay on Abramovich, and he started it with describing himself in a train compartment, traveling through the Jewish Pale, and the books of Abramovich, Mandela in his hands, and he looks outside and he looks in the book and there's no difference. That in spite of the fact that he would travel in the Jewish Pale around 1900, and the reality that was described in these works was about 50 years earlier. But that was the idea, that there was a complete correspondence. We know that this is not true. And this is actually harmful, because once the wave of nostalgia swept Jewish thinking after the war, after the Second World War, people started to see that the Mendele world was not the real Jewish world, or an exact replica of it. For instance, it was seen both here by Yankov Gladstein and in Palestine, Israel, by Avrom Kariv and others. For instance, Hasidism was not mentioned almost there. Hasidism was the strongest movement in Eastern Europe. All these Ukrainian shtetler must have been Hasidic at the time. But Abramovich almost never touched the issue of Hasidism. In his early Hebrew novel, Ha'ovos Ha'bonim, The Fathers and the Sons, there is an issue about the Hasidim and the Hasidic court and so on and so forth. But he kept away from that, and he advised Sholem Aleichem later on to do the same, saying, Hanach lo leravia sheme'atzmo nafal. Leave alone the drunkard. He will fall of his own volition. He will collapse by himself. You don't have to push him. That was the idea. But we have to see, it's impossible. No fiction, no matter how realistic, is really a direct depiction of historical reality, but certainly no fiction which is deeply and fiercely satirical. Satire is essentially selective. It takes the things that it wants to expose, and therefore it's a different picture of what reality was. There are many caricatures, exaggerations, and so on. It's enough to remember the names of the three little towns to see that Abramovich was talking about aspects of life that he wanted to expose. Popperville, Kaptsansk, where you cannot make a living, you have to leave. To Niadivke, the city, the town of laggards, where you do nothing. You let your wife somehow supply the food, and you just do nothing. And Glupsk, the city of fools, which is a city of Jewish commerce, which is based on nothing solid. Then we remember Mendele. Not only the world, not only the territory, the little towns, the Mendele figure. It's a very, very complex construct. For one thing, it's not a pseudonym. Certainly, it's not a direct representative of the author himself. It's a character. It's a character with physiognomy, biography, profession, and more than anything else, with a way of talking, with a meandering way of commenting on things, a kind of a causerie, of light way of dealing with things that zigzag, that go from one thing to another, and every few passages it will say, but not, this is not what I intend to tell you. Nicht das bin ich heus. And that's usually where he made his esoterical point. Forget about it. This is not my main thing. So Mendele was invented early on in Abramovich's first Yiddish story. It was mentioned in 1864 as so many, as a person who can publish and bring to the public manuscripts that are real. That is 18th century way of looking at fiction, at prose fiction. Prose fiction, the novel, unlike the romance, is real. It deals with what's there in life, with everything in it, warts and all. And therefore, the best way of representing it is by documents, letters, journals, confessions, memoirs, and so on, that were not even meant to be published. They were left somehow or given away. And now you need a figure of the person who takes these manuscripts and makes them public and go to the public and publishes them. And he has to explain how he got them, why he publishes them. And he has to be a professional, like a collector of antiques or a journalist or a book peddler, somebody in the Jewish neighborhood who sells books, but also from time to time publishes them when there's a manuscript that can make a penny and he thinks that it's worth his while to do, or he's being paid to do that. That's what he was. We have in 18th century English fiction, German fiction, dozens of such characters. And in Russian literature of the beginning of the 20th century, which is still hankering after the 18th century in Europe, this is a very common thing. The question is why this character, which was only the one who had to bring the manuscript, be it the manuscript of the protagonist of the Sholem Mendele, kind of an egotist, a man of very narrow mind that had towards his death a kind of a revelation that he lived a terrible life and everybody should know about it and behave differently. It's a kind of a confession. And other stories, other manuscripts, the manuscript of Isrolik, the crazy person who in the Klatsche, in the Neg, and so on. Why this Mendele became so important in Abramovich's work is something that I try to explain in my early book, Traveler Disguised, and I will not go into now. There are good reasons for that. And finally, we have another image that was sort of imposed upon us of Abramovich as a supreme artist, as the one who more than anybody else, took care with what he did in terms of aesthetic perfection. Here's what Sholem Aleichem supposedly quotes from a letter of Abramovich, but is not what it's written really in the letter that he refers to. Here's what he says. Über a Werklebeinikel bedarf man schwitzen. Man bedarf arbeiten, feilen, itlichs Wort, gedenkt, was sag euch, feilen, feilen. Polish, Polish. What you have to do, you have to sweat over an opus, to work your fingers off. Polish every single word. Remember what I tell you, Polish, Polish. So this became a kind of an image, a kind of a way of looking at Abramovich. Now, what are we missing in this picture, made of these components? Is anything important forgotten when we talk about all this? I think the answer is yes. And in a way, it's inferred by the concept of the traveler disguised. If he's disguised, what's behind the disguise? What's under it? If he lets an ironic persona talk for him, like Mendele, irony works by using the opposite. What is behind the irony? What is there to start with that had to be camouflaged, that had to be disguised in order for the story to make its course through Jewish life and Jewish audience? This question calls to mind another way of looking at Abramovich. We tend to think about him as a person who was focused and really working on each of his main works, of his main stories, again and again and again throughout 60 years of a career. At that time, it was a very long career. He died at the age of 81. And there was a kind of a continuity to his career that was enviable, that was kind of emblematic. But is that true? It's not. In the career of Abramovich, there were great big intermissions, more than intermissions, lacunae. Things were missed. More than anything else I have in mind, the 6-7 years from 1879 to 1886 that he almost wrote nothing, published nothing. He was paralyzed. He was finished as far as his fellow writers were concerned. Nobody believed that he was going to emerge again as a living author. I'm not going to go into the reasons for that kind of long paralysis. Throughout these years, he published only one thing, a play of a relatively secondary importance, the Prisiv, the Draft, that is in 1884, but actually, after a decade in the 70s of a very, very intense activity with the publication of two of the great works he was to produce. In 1873, the Nag, Die Klatsche, I think one of his greatest works. And in 1878, Kitzer Masoes Binyamin Ashlishi, Benjamin III, The Travels of Benjamin III, and many other things. I mean, you go through his bibliography and you see it was full. Among other things, by the way, that's important. He published at that decade a series of long essays in Hebrew, without which you cannot understand the Yiddish works. For instance, Masoes Binyamin Ashlishi appeared together with a book-length essay on chauvinism and nationalism, Ahava Leumit V'Toldotea, nationalist self-love and its results, a critique of nationalism. Although he accepts nationalism, but he criticizes it sharply, particularly with chauvinist examples. If you don't read that, you cannot read Benjamin and really understand what he's telling you there. All these essays were forgotten completely. They were never collected. They were really suppressed. And they are a whole set of works in their own right. You will have to have like 3-4 volumes of the essays, critiques, literary criticism, which caused storms in Hebrew literature of the 1860s, all forgotten. But that's going to show you that there was not that kind of continuity in the life of Abramovich. The things happened and then were left alone and even suppressed, as I said, forgotten. After this decade of the 70s, Abramovich wrote poems in this decade. A long, long book-length epic, allegorical, by the name of YIVO, very strange and important in its own right. He was not a great versifier, but he wrote these things. In the late 1880s, he re-emerges like a second life as a Hebrew writer, starting to write his Hebrew short stories that then were adopted into Yiddish, on issues of the time, Zionism, emigration to Palestine, pogroms, and so on. And you ask yourself, what's in between, and why is this intermission in his career? And as I said, I'm not going into the reasons. It was studied by his biographers, and it will be really shown as it was in a new biography of Abramovich, which is being prepared by in Jerusalem now. What I would like to say, however, is that when we look at the career of Abramovich, before and after this intermission, you see vast differences between what it was and what then it became. It's the same writer, of course, nevertheless, very, very different in every aspect, in every way. Let me mention a few of the differences, to the extent that a new Mendele kind of template was invented in the 80s, and it suppressed, it buried the other one that belonged to the 60s and the 70s of the 19th century. Some of the differences. To start with, the difference between a novelist and a writer. This is an important distinction. Der Erzähler, Schreiber. Dichter, Schriftsteller. Romancier, écrivain. Romanist, pisatel. The difference is this. Many novelists or poets write also about other things and participate in intellectual life of their time. But they are essentially poets or novelists. In Hebrew writing, it's Mapu is a novelist, primarily. That's what he does. That's what he does best. But there is another kind of writer who may write a novel, like Rousseau wrote The New Eloise, but he's not a novelist. He's not primarily a novelist. Chernyshevsky, Nikolais, that was a very important figure at the time, wrote a novel, very important one, called What to Do, with a big question mark. But he was not a novelist. He was a critic, a literary critic. He was a social critic. He was a philosopher, not a novelist. Now, in the 60s and the 70s, Abramovich was not a romancier. He was a pisatel. He was a schreiber. He was a sofer, lo mesaper. That means not only that he wrote in so many different genres. As I said, he wrote poems, he wrote particularly articles and essays. He wrote literary criticism. He wrote a book on biology, a kind of a primer on biology in 3 big volumes, Toldot HaTeva, and many other things. Yes, he also wrote stories in Yiddish and in Hebrew, Limdu Heitev, and so on. But it was part of what he did. He was primarily a pisatel, a schreiber, a writer, not a novelist. He became primarily a novelist in the 90s. In the final 20 or 25 years of his life. That's one important difference. The other is between an artist and intellectual. Young Abramovich was not seen primarily as an artist. He was seen, and he wanted to be seen, as an intellectual. He was involved in any number of very fierce polemics, like the Russian intellectuals of the time. He wanted to deal with ideas, with concepts, not only to tell stories. Yes, he also wrote stories, particularly in Yiddish, for an audience that could be reached only through narrative, rather than discourse, rather than essays. But at the same time, he wrote in Hebrew a whole series of essays on education. That was the beginning of all the people of the Enlightenment. But then he went on to other topics, not education at all, colonialism, nationalism, the use of force in political life, in social life, and so many other issues that were the issues of the time. Later on, all this was kind of pushed aside. To the extent that he touches upon these topics, it's always indirect. It's through a story. It's through the figures, through what happens in the story. So that's, I think, a very important difference between the early Abramovich and the late Abramovich. And then there's another one, which I doubt that I can fully explain here. The issue of bilingualism, which is so important to understand what he was trying to do. There's a difference between Abramovich's earlier bilingualism and later bilingualism. The earlier bilingualism is differential. That is, every language has its own tasks, different from the others. Hebrew is for biology, for essays, for literary criticism, for anything which deals directly with discourse. Yiddish is for humor, for telling stories, for a Mandela kind of thing. So there's Abramovich's later bilingualism is integral, not differential, in the sense that you write the same thing in both languages. So you produce a novel in Hebrew version, in Yiddish version. Actually, what Abramovich tried to do in the last decade, or more than one decade, 15 years of his life, is to create two sets of his works that were in Yiddish and Hebrew and were the same works. Masois ben Yomin HaShlishi, Das Windspiegel, which is in Hebrew is called Be'ebek Habacha, and so on and so forth. This is a very different kind of bilingualism. And by the way, it's bilingualism which is in a way unnecessary, because all the readers of the Hebrew texts read the Yiddish ones at the time. Obviously, of course they knew Yiddish, and they read Yiddish if they read the Hebrew. So they read the Hebrew for the fine things that were achieved through the translation, through adaptation, really. The jokes, the scholarly, way the mind of the Talmudist works in Hebrew. It's very enjoyable to the person who understands or who is familiar with the sources. Nobody understands it now in Israel. Nobody. They read the text and they don't know what it says, what it refers to. They can read the story. The story is somehow coming out, but what all these jokes, these little scholastic jokes, mean, they know nothing about. By the way, I'm telling you, I'm now retranslating Abramovich from the Yiddish, forgetting about the Hebrew version. Of course, I cannot forget about it. But I do try, I make an effort not to think about it at all, and to reproduce the spoken Yiddish of the original in spoken Israeli Hebrew. So it comes very different. That's an important difference. And finally, Mendele. I want to tell you something about it. I have every reason to believe that from in the late 60s and the early 70s of the, of course, the 19th century, Abramovich grew tired of Mendele. Mendele was not a good vehicle anymore. He was looking for another vehicle. And this vehicle had to be crazy. We have parts of his diary that was saved from the Mendele Museum in Odessa simply because in 1939, Vorobeichik, who was the curator of the museum, published some parts of the diaries of Abramovich in a collection which is called Mendele und sein Zeit. And that's how we know. There's nothing left in that place in Odessa, as far as I know. And there you see that he's working towards an idea of a persona that is crazy in the 18th century sense of satire, that you have to take a person completely removed from society, from the ordinary, from the order of the world in order to see it satirically and to see its imperfection. And this person had to be crazy. We have in French literature of the 18th century, in English literature in the 18th century, and in Russian of the 19th century, Gogol, many examples of the usage of such a persona. The difference between a Mendele and a persona like that eventually is the writer of Die Klatsche, Sholem Yankev Abramovitsh, is that the crazy person can be an intellectual of the first order. He can discuss ideas. He can write long harangues about issues, whereas Mendele, in his folksy way, cannot do that. He has to be ironic and entertaining. It's not the same thing. And there is evidence that in the 70s, Abramovich started writing stories through Yisrulik Domishiginer. The Klatsche was only supposed to be the first volume of a new set of works, written by the crazy person. But that was cut short by this interregnum after 1879. And he never came back to it. Stories that were written by Yisrulik Domishiginer, like the wonderful little story, The Baibak, were the laggard, were not published by Abramovich. He suppressed them. They were published after his death by the Soviet critics, the Soviet scholars who had access to the manuscripts. So Mendele was a problem. Mendele offered a way of dealing with Jewish reality which, from a vantage point which was between the reality and the enlightened writer, somewhere in the middle, and thus being able to connect to, he was moving from town to town, exposed to nature and to some aesthetic experience of nature. So he did not exactly belong within the shtetl, but then he came to the shtetl and was part of it. So he could negotiate. Now you had to have a figure that was torn out of the shtetl because he was crazy. That is, because he completely disconnected himself from that reality. So that, I think, is the most important. difference. Mendele the joker, Mendele the folksy philosopher, completely controlled the later part of Abramovich's work. And we remember, to the same extent that he pushed the writer away. And we know him as Mendele, rather than Sholem Yankev Abramovitch. Okay. So we can answer now the question. What was disguised? What was hidden? The intellectual. The free, fierce intellectual that Abramovich tried to be in the 60s and the 70s. The pisater, the intellectual, not the artist, not the one whose main issue is mimetic, description. This is the hidden Abramovich. The Abramovich who is trying to deal with ideas, with concepts, who loves discourse rather than description, and the imagination. I'll come to that in a minute. Now, the two, if we want to acquaint ourselves with this intellectual, we have two texts we have to go back to. The two great works of the 70s, Masoes Benjamin Shlishi and Diklache, particularly Diklache, of 1873. Both of these works don't really belong in the 19th century and in the realistic tradition, as we think of Mandela as the one who brought this tradition to Yiddish and Hebrew writing. They are both 18th century works. Diklache the genre of Diklache is the apologue. I don't know, this term is not being used often, so let me explain it. The apologue is a story. Let me immediately start with an example. Candide by Voltaire, Zadig by Voltaire, Rasselas by Samuel Johnson. It's a story with a discourse, really often about a naive person who seeks the truth. And he goes away from his home, usually with a guide, and has to face life. And as he faces life, he understands that what he thought was good and true was not necessarily good and true. That's a genre, very important genre in the 18th century, which is kind of a novel, but it's not a novel. It's controlled by discourse, by ideas, by allegories, rather than by mimetic description of family, of places, and so on and so forth. To the apologue, in this case, in Diklache, a young man goes into the world to seek the truth and to become himself, to live by the truth, not only the truth, the Vernunft, reason, pure reason in the Kantian sense, by completely rationalizing his life. He realizes, I'll talk about it later, that you can do that, it's impossible. But in the meantime, he goes first with Diklache, who is an allegorical symbol of the Jewish people, and then with Satan. That was taken right away, right out of Faust, where Faust goes with Mephisto throughout Germany to seek ideas, pleasures, and experiences. And in this case, the Gretchen of the story is the Klatsche, is the nag, is the poor little horse that he's leaving behind when he's going with the devil on his huge adventure. He sees from great heights the entire modern world, urban cities, industry, wars, whatever. So that's really an 18th century piece of work. I would say the same is true for Benjamin. It's also a story about a naive person who leaves home in search of something. In this case, there were Jews, Jewish independence, what the free Jewish state beyond the river Sambatyon and all the other legends told by medieval travelers such as Eldad Hadani, Benjamin Mitudela, Petachia Regensburg, and so on. And there too, as you should see, I'll come to that in a few minutes, what you have is a kind of an idea developing, rather a mimetic story, although there is a description of Tonyadevke and a description of Teterivke and of Glupsk and so on in this story. Now, let's talk a little bit about Kitzer Masoris Binyamin Ashlishi, which is one of the works of Abramovich best known by the readers. The main motive or motif of this story is movement. The story starts by a quotation from the Midrash. Rabbi Simon said, "There is not one blade of grass which is not controlled by a star in heaven, which hits it and hits it, urging it to grow, 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 grow." And then he goes from this quotation to talk about the Jewish world and the world at large, that it's full of movement, starting with the stars in the sky and ending with his own writing. Because why did he write? He writes because he is being hit by somebody who says to him, "Oh, Mendele, go, write." Let me read it the way he says it. I felt as if I were being tapped from above and told, "Arise, O Mendele, get thee from thy cozy corner by the hearth, and take thou a pinch of Benjamin spices, and whip up a dish for your Jewish brothers, such as they relish." So even writing is part of that kind of movement. And of course, that's the satire, that you have a world which is totally static in Tuniadevke. It's not the world of Kaptsansk, where people have to leave young, and then they become servants in Glupsk. The daughters are being used by the prostitution industry, the Jewish prostitution industry in Glupsk. There was much of it, and later on it became international when South America became the main market. Abramovich and other Yiddish writers of the time wrote about it a lot. We forget about it. Sholem Aleichem wrote about it in the story about the man from Buenos Aires and other stories. So, movement. Actually, what he's after is to take Jewish life as it's represented, as it's portrayed in Tuniadevke. Therefore, Tuniadevke is a city or town of laggards, of people who do nothing. Betalon in Hebrew. They batlonim. They don't do nothing. And expose it as the quintessential medieval world. The medieval world is understood as a word without movement. The modern world is where movement takes place. And that the wish of Benjamin to move, to travel, to go beyond the Sambatyon is a travesty of modernism. And why? Actually, the story of Benjamin takes place on a double historical background, against a double historical background. The story says that it took place in the days of the Crimean War. That is 1853-56, the last years of the regime of Nicholas I. And indeed, many details in the story confirm this. Not only we have the scene in the Teterivke Bes Medrash where the Batlonim assume the roles of the participants in the war, the Crimean War. One of them is a representative of Vite, which is Victoria, which is Britain. The other is representative of Yishmael, of the Ottoman Empire. And Itzik Pashtan is the representative of the Tsarist Empire. And he's a stupid person in this entire place. But, for instance, the story about the kidnapping of Benjamin and Sandor into the Russian army, into the Tsarist army, is also a story of the Nicholas era rather than a later era. But that's one background. The other background is that of the 1870s, really when the story was written. And how do we know that? There are any number of indications that this is what's there. For instance, the sense of deep disappointment with the regime of Alexander II. Alexander II started his career as the Tsar who would bring modernism into Tsarist Russia, who would free the vassals, who would change, would further the purpose of capitalism in Russia, of train, transportation, and so on. And then in the 70s, there was a sense that he didn't do that, really. This is indicated in Masoret Binyamin Ashlishi in a beautiful dream that Binyamin has about when he's going to be a soldier. He doesn't know it yet. The dream is he meets with his great hero, with Alexander of Macedonia, Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander of Macedonia, by the way, is a great hero of Hebrew medieval literature. And there's any number of novels, or little novels, about Alexander and his life. And as much as Binyamin is very adept, he reads every medieval story that and it's quoted in his writings, then Alexander is the example. He wants to go, like Alexander went to India, he wants to go to beyond the river Sambation. But then in the dream, Binyamin meets Alexander. I realized, I'm sorry, in a minute. I turned out, and there was Alexander. "Your Excellency," I cried, seizing his hand and squeezing it as tight as I could. The dream is long. Just then, there was a horrible stink that I thought I was going to faint. I opened my eyes, and in my hand was a crushed bedbug. "Fe," he says. So that belongs clearly in the 1870s rather than the 1850s. But that's not the only thing. The politics of the 1870s, which in a way were a continuation of the Crimean War, is what the book is very much about. In this politics, the European powers fought the Ottoman Empire, including Russia, in order to get to the Middle East, and through the Middle East to Africa and to Asia. In 1869, the Suez Canal was opened. In 1875, when a few months before Abramovich started writing this story, a Jew by the name of Benjamin Disraeli, bought the stocks of the Suez Canal Company for Victoria, for Britain, and it was a huge scandal. In 1878, when Benjamin III was published, Benjamin Disraeli, together with Bismarck, made the Berlin Congress. It was published when the Berlin Congress was going on, which completely pushed the Ottoman Empire out of the Balkan and achieved what Russia wanted to achieve in the 50s, control over the European citizens of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in Palestine. The holy places, the Pravoslav inhabitants, the inhabitants of Austria, Jews included, of Britain, and so on. The consul would have the jurisdiction about them. Now, Abramovich was to write another chapter to Benjamin, the traitor, in Hebrew. It doesn't exist in Yiddish, in which Benjamin goes to the Suez Canal, crosses it, and goes to do things in the Far East. And you know, when Abramovich decided to adapt Masoret Benjamin Ashlishi into Hebrew, when another Benjamin by the name of Herzl published Judenstaat in 1896 and called for a Zionist Congress. And certainly Abramovich was aiming at him. This is the Benjamin of our story. So Benjamin, as a caricature of a traveler, of a politician, of a person who seeks whatever he seeks, he wants to create a Jewish state. He is going from the other side of Sambatyon to bring the Jews, the free Jews of the 10 lost tribes, into Palestine and to create a Jewish state. So this is very much about politics and the place of Jews in Europe of the colonialist era at its height. The Congress of Berlin is the apogee of that era, actually leading to World War I directly, actually. Read the beautiful, wonderful analysis of the Berlin Congress and its consequences written by Lenin, that in Imperial Criticism, as he explains why this led to World War I. In any case, Abramovich is not sitting here in the little enclave of Tuniadevka. He's talking about the things that Europe talks about in this novel, that Europe is interested in. Ideas, positions, and he criticizes them. Because how does the novel end? Supposedly it's only the first part, but that's the novel as it is. It ends by a critique, a harsh critique of the use of force. So he's not only talking about colonialism, he's critiquing colonialism in this story. And who is the one who does the criticism in this story? Benjamin. As you know, both Benjamin and Sandel were kidnapped and forced into the army, and Benjamin and Sandel tried to go away. And they were caught, and there's a trial, a military trial, and in the military trial, Benjamin says, suppose you were walking along one fine day and somebody stuffed you into a sack. Wouldn't you do all you could to get out of it? I see that kidnapping men in broad daylight and selling them like chickens in the market is permitted, but that when the same men seek to free themselves, they are guilty of a crime. If that is upside-down world we live in, I don't know what right and wrong are. That's a quote. And it belongs in a discussion when you should only open the essay, Ahava Leumit V'Toldotea, National Self-Love and Its Results, written in Hebrew at the same time in 1878, you'll see the same ideas. Much enlarged, because this is only Benjamin. And there he talks for 50 pages about the use of force for national purposes. Now, I should start to close my presentation. Let's talk a little bit about the Klatsche. A grand, wonderful work of art. And work of, on a par with anything written in English, French, and German in this field of ideas that I can think of. And by the way, Literature was the most successful story Abramovich ever published in terms of selling of the audience. It was the best-known work for many years. Then it was forgotten, or half forgotten. But for many years, Linetsky, Abramovich's rival, who hated his guts, had to call him, he called him the Klachnik. And you can hear the envy. It was a hugely successful thing because this is an allegory, and people would sit in the Beth Medrash and try to say, this is this, what this means, and so on. It was a sport, reading this work. But what is the work actually about? Not thinking now, or not really emphasizing the allegory about Jewish history, both in the past and in the present. And by the way, it's very, very similar to the allegory in Moshe Leib Halperin's poem, Anacht. I would say the allegory in Moshe Leib Halperin's poem is based on this allegory in Literature by Abramovich. I don't believe that the Halperin scholars really saw that. Okay, we have a young man who decides to cut himself away from Jewish society so that he can live his life by reason, rationally. The first thing he had to do rationally is not to marry, because he doesn't have a profession. So he has to study for the Russian matriculation and then go to university. Supposedly he would be accepted in anti-Semitic Russian university and study medicine. That he will become a nitzlech, a useful person. Fine. And he wants to do that throughout his behavior, in every aspect of his behavior. For instance, he has to prepare for the Russian exams, the matriculation, which of course he will fail. Because the Russian matriculation, the Russian program is suffused with Russian folklore, with Russian legends, with Russian poetry, and he hates it. He says, mathematics, I understand that. I have a Gemara Keppel. I can learn anything which has to do with reason. But to learn history? Well, history is a series of wars and just murderous events, and you have to remember every one of them and remember the dates. And what is myth and legend? It's nonsense. All these stories about Baba Yaga and about Koschei, the famous Russian witch, male witch, and all the stories about metamorphosis. Animals become other animals, or become people, or people become animals, and so on and so forth. He goes back to to Latin literature, and so on. He remembers all this nonsense. He cannot remember them. And he hates literary criticism. There's a beautiful passage, brilliant passage. It's long, I couldn't translate for you, in which he talks about the analysis of poetry by literary critics and how idiotic it is, and how you don't need to look in this direction at all. But he has to prepare for the exams, and in the exams they demand just that, not only mathematics and foreign languages. He can learn Latin grammar. That is fine. Okay. That's what he wants to do, and he has to convince his mother, who is a clever, simple Jewish woman of the shtetl, and she knows that he's doing something that is not going to work. Because she looks at him, he's already 20 years old, and he has this nice little beard, and she assumes, without saying it, that the sexuality is there. But he completely represses that. She said, marry, have a woman with you. No, because then children, then you lose all your money, then you become a Meckler, then, no. What the story is telling you then is that when you do live by rationalism, you become crazy. And that's why it's crazy. When, for instance, you repress your sexual drive, then you join Satan. And Satan, among other things, is Walpurgis. It's the Sabbath of witches. It's debauchery. When you hate the myth, you have to live it as it is, brutally. You meet Baba Yaga, you meet Koschei, and you meet the devil. When you hate metamorphosis, you will be exposed to metamorphosis. Here you meet a horse, a nag, who is the Jewish people. A Ben Melech that became a nag. So it's what we have in this story is a critique of enlightenment, of rationalism, as a way of life, which is exactly what intellectual Europe in the days of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche was dealing with. It's not anything other than what was talked about in German universities at the time and in English public life. So Abramovich is not, again, a writer of Glupsk. He writes from the vantage point of Glupsk, where everything is vitiated by the conditions of Jewish life. But he writes about the question, can you live by pure reason? Can you be, in this sense, a Kantian? What about human development, the history of the human race? Does it justify the idea of progress? No. It's in a pre-Darwinian mood, it's the story of survival. It's the story of terrible, fierce war about survival. Can the Jewish people be expected to become masculine, to become enlightened before their economic condition is changed? No. You cannot dance. You cannot really jump before you eat your breakfast. And many, many other such questions. The devil takes a sulik in the air to see what modernism and rationalism did to the human race. Industry. The Middle Ages is rustic, is fields. Come industry, urbanism, and destroys them. And there's a huge description of air pollution. Air pollution is discussed in a whole chapter, what the industry does to the environment. In the 70s of the 19th century, I'm talking, not today, when all of us deal with this. Then there is the issue of reading. And one of the great goals of enlightenment is to make everybody able to read and write. But reading and writing is the source of propaganda. And propaganda is the way of poisoning the mind of people. And there's a description exactly how the servants of the devil write in the newspapers and what kind of ink they use from a lake of ink. So this is, it's not that Abramovich, who was, of course, like all the other masculine, all the other people of the Jewish and Hebrew Enlightenment, are all for the Enlightenment and for rationalism, really says that they should be pushed away, they should be abrogated, whatever. He says that, but that you cannot live with them without them being subdued by another force, which is, on the one hand, nationalism, but not chauvinism, community, folklore, poetry, but also, and particularly, the Kantian moral category, the categorical command to be more moral, which is not substantiated by logic. It's something inherent. And that's what happened at the end of the story. Because what Satan wants from Srolik, he wants him to become debauched, to become egocentric, to use the Jewish people, to ride on the nag, to exploit it like everybody else. And Srolik, in spite of everything, refuses. And that's the moral command. No explanation why. He just refuses to do that. That's the way the story ends. So here again we have an opus that is at the height of intellectual discourse of the time. And it was buried under the later work of Abramovich. It was disguised. And that's why what I want to do with you and to do now is to talk about a traveler undisguised, to take off and to show the kernel of this great Jewish intellectual, 19th century Jewish intellectual, that was writing stories and other things, and to remember him also as the modern intellectual in Jewish letters. Thank you. If anybody wants to make a comment or to ask a question, I'll take the question, and if not, we'll say nicely goodbye. Nobody I can see. Okay, thank you. You want it? Wait. Yes.
You spoke about the suppression of Mendele's work, his essays, and so forth. Who was doing the suppression?
First and foremost, he himself. He wanted to become this kind of the Mendele character, the great artist, and he didn't want to remember his masculine, his enlightened past. But he was helped by everybody around. All the critics of the time helped to do just that. And it's the ideal that of art and of description. Art is mimesis, is something you describe. Is that you put yourself vis-a-vis life and you create a beautiful replica of it. And whatever went with discourse was kind of pushed aside. It belonged to the 19th century. It belonged to the Haskalah, to the Jewish Enlightenment. It was not modern in that sense. And Abramovich, there were other reasons why Abramovich chose to write only his stories in the last 2 decades of his life. Among other things, it enabled him not to choose between Zionism and Yiddishism, but to kind of juggle both one against the other. If he would have written an essay on that, he wouldn't be able to do that. He would have to say what he had to say, and which he did forcefully. I have a suggestion to the YIVO. Publish the essays, the Hebrew essays of Abramovich. By the way, Abramovich remembered it in 1914, after he published the 2 famous Jubiläum Ausgabe of his works, the Mahadurat HaYovel was published in 3 big volumes between 1909 and 1911, and the 17 volumes of the Yiddish version of the Jubiläum Ausgabe, published between 1911 and 1913. In 1914, Abramovich asked Bialik, "And what about my Hebrew articles?" And Bialik didn't really want to publish them because they were articles of a masculine. That was long ago. But he was really, he had to agree to publish them. But then World War I broke out, and everything was finished. So let's publish them.
So we will accept that challenge, provided that you write the introduction to this.
First, you have to collect them. Of course, I would willingly do that, but you have to collect them from all the newspapers of the 19th century, Hamelit, Hamagid, and so on and so forth, because they were they were completely forgotten by scholars. The only scholar who really took interest in them was Soviet, Meir Wiener, who wrote about Mendele in the 70s. He wrote an important study, Marxist study. That's not important, the way you look at it. But what's important is that you try to understand what was going on in this decade. So, yes, that's something which should be done. In Hebrew, of course, because they were written in Hebrew. Okay, thank you.